Thanks, everybody, for joining again. I'm Nuala O'Connor. I'm the president and CEO of the Center for Democracy and Technology and co-chair of this year's CFP 2014, our 24th year. So I think we should all get ready for a big 25th next year. Many of us were here last night, and we heard a certain vision of the world from our former DHS colleague, Tom Ridge. We are also honored to be joined today by my other DHS colleague, Stewart Baker, who has had a long and illustrious career, as you all know, in many forms of government service. Thank you very much for your service. Stewart has no qualms about being provocative, and so I don't want to take up any of his airtime, but to say that we are excited to hear from you. And my one question for you to start things off was really, you've seen and done a great deal. What in that history has informed the place where you are now in your thinking about these issues of national security and surveillance and information? And what do you want to tell us? What do you want us to know? And where do you think this is all going?
Yeah, okay. None of you are gonna want to hear it, but so I'll say it once, and then you can ask me, deliver speeches in the form of questions in response. My journey on the privacy issue comes from having spent time at NSA as general counsel, and having been persuaded that it was important for civil liberties reasons to maintain a strict separation between intelligence and law enforcement, and the intelligence and law enforcement uses of the data that we gathered. It was an important principle, and one where, I have to say that as general counsel, I thought, well, this is probably a good idea, and why not? A little more privacy is bound to be a good thing. And it's politically sensitive to deny the appropriate separation of civil liberties of law enforcement and intelligence. So why not do it? And I thought of myself as kind of a middle of the road, privacy is a good thing, why not have more of it kind of person. And then, to be candid, the wall between law enforcement and national security just kept getting higher and higher. The high point was reached in what seems to be the perennial civil liberties high point in modern times, the second term of a Democratic president, which seems to be when we always, all the Republicans discover their civil liberties roots, and the ACLU continues to have a substantial amount of support, and so you get a lot of left-right coalitions in the second term of Democratic administrations. And we certainly got that in the second term of Bill Clinton. The result was that the FISA court felt quite comfortable imposing the wall with or without legal justification. And by September of 2001, that wall had cost us an enormous amount of credibility and frankly lives. The inability of the depth of the divide had left the FBI unable to use its resources to find the hijackers before they actually hijacked the planes. And that was in substantial part, you can never say exactly, but it was in substantial part, in my view, the result of the FISA court pursuing civil liberties at all costs, a kind of privacy error that cost us very dearly. And from that time, I've become more and more skeptical of the principle that we ought to just have more privacy, because more privacy is bound to be a good thing. And skeptical of the idea that you can't have too much privacy, that there really isn't a downside to a little more privacy. I've seen what I believe is a very substantial downside to adopting new privacy doctrines without regard to what the consequences will be for law enforcement and intelligence agencies trying to do their job. And that has made me, frankly, I once said to somebody, there's really only one job I want in government now. When they name a chief privacy skeptic, that's what I want to do, because I think that being skeptical about claims that we need more privacy is likely to cause more pain and more trouble and maybe more deaths than we would like. And that's sort of the principle that has governed my approach to privacy issues in the last 10 years. Not at all, I understand, a popular view here, but I've been saying this at CFP since 1996, so nobody's completely surprised.
We're going to have to share the mic. A couple of thoughts on that. Well, one's more personal. We're going to save that for a drink. But the one question I have is, it sounded a little bit like you're blaming the FBI for not having connected the dots. I mean, we have a CIA, we have an NSA, we have agencies that, and you were instrumental yourself in creating, a very logical barrier between law enforcement and national security. There are many, even in the Bush administration, who would argue we had the data. What we failed to do was connect the dots effectively among the intelligence agencies. And then we have folks today, and going back for the last 12 years now in the FBI, saying the right turn we have taken in terms of FBI and other law enforcement agencies focusing on terrorism as opposed to serious crimes has diminished the resources for person-to-person domestic crime in a way that is concerning and troubling to folks in law enforcement. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
So on the first point, there's no doubt that there were many errors on the route to 9/11. And you can go back and say, if they'd only done this, we wouldn't have had the problem. And there is an inclination on the part of the privacy advocates to come up with their favorite scenario for avoiding 9/11 and say, you can't tell us that 9/11 would have been avoided by following your scenario, because we've got a scenario we really prefer. And in their scenario, there are no turf conflicts, and the FBI and the CIA lie down and sing Kumbaya together. And if that just would happen, and that's what the 9/11 Commission said they should do, we would solve the problem. So problem solved, because the 9/11 Commission said that should happen. But these are big institutions. There will always be some turf consciousness. That strikes me as probably not actually a solution to the problem, and certainly the idea that we only need to come up with one magic solution for the problems we had before 9/11 is unrealistic. And then finally, the last clear chance that we had to stop this, that attack, came in August of 2001, when at last everybody got it. Everybody said, damn, they're here. They really have a plan. And the biggest of the FBI counterterrorism intelligence side, law enforcement side, working groups, the Cole Bombing Task Force, I'm guessing at this, because this is classified and I haven't seen it, but I'm guessing that was the Cole Task Force, got word that these guys were here. They had 2 weeks to find them. They said, let us at them. We can find them. We got dozens, maybe hundreds of agents working on the Cole Task Force. These are guys who are associated with Al-Qaeda. We can bring it inside of our law enforcement authorities and go look all across the country and find them. If they had done that, they would have found them, is my guess. We'll never know for sure. Instead, they were told, sit down, shut up. You were not allowed to be on this side of the wall. They sent out emails that said, my God, people are going to die. The guys who are getting the protection from this wall are the worst people on the planet, and they're trying to kill us, and how can we possibly give them this kind of protection? It was evocative, and I still get a little emotional about how prescient that objection was. Why were they told to sit down and shut up? It's perfectly clear when you look at the record, and I'd spent some time looking at the classified documents on this, or the declassified reports about this. they were told to sit down and shut up by the lawyers because the FISA court had, in the 6 months before that, taken an FBI agent who was a special agent in charge and reamed him, put him in a position where he was being investigated and quite possibly going to be charged with making false statements to the FISA court because he had said, yes, I'm obeying the wall, but he wasn't obeying it the way the FISA court thought he should. There's no doubt that it was the wall and the FISA court's administration of that wall that shut down that last chance we had. That strikes me as, you don't have to, you can have alternative ways that could have been solved, but when you miss your last clear chance, you ought to ask, what are we doing about that? And the answer is, increasingly, we are not learning that lesson. So that's why I feel strongly about that. I feel strongly in part because I felt that I contributed to the wall. So this is, conservative guilt in action. The question whether we're spending too much time chasing terrorists and not enough time chasing criminals, the FBI is never going to catch most of the criminals in the country. They are a very sophisticated, but they are to law enforcement what the Marines are to the military. They are not going to hold territory. They are going to take a beach and then hand it over to the Army. And so they are, to some extent, discretionary in what they pursue. We're not going to have more or less street crime based on what they do. So the question is, what are you most concerned about? They've certainly done a lot of white-collar criminal work, even with all the terrorist stuff. And they've dramatically expanded. So I'm not sure that I would say we've lost out in criminal enforcement.
So thank you for that, because I was going towards the guilt word, actually. I've always supposed that was part of it. I know a lot of people who... I didn't want to prompt any tears in this panel. I've been known to make grown men cry several times in the last several weeks, and I didn't want to add you to the list, Stewart. So that's more information than any of you needed to know. But more seriously, what happens next? It seems to me, it feels then, that because of what you have described, the pendulum has now swung in the other direction. Where do we go from here in your... If you were king, where would we go from here? And where do you think we actually are going to go from here on 215, 702, et cetera?
Yeah, I think we've made a fundamentally wrong turn on this stuff. And it was engineered by Snowden and Greenwald. They told us about the collection 2 or 2.5 weeks before they told us about all the restrictions on what you could do with the collected data, and I think they did that quite deliberately in order to set the narrative prior to providing all of the facts. But the narrative is set. But the problem with the narrative is it's government having large amounts of data is a bad thing, and the problem with that, in my mind, is getting large amounts of data is the technology of the next 10 years. It's just going to happen. The data is not going to stop coming because we say NSA can't look at it. Other people will look at it, from the Chinese to the DEA to Google and Facebook. And so as the data gets cheaper, lots of things become clear that enable us to catch terrorists. The terrorists have taken enormous advantage of new technology. You look at the Mumbai attack, they were using VoIP and satellite phones and GPS and Google satellite photos to navigate. You can't just sit down and say, well, we never had big data before, so why should we have it now? Because the bad guys didn't have GPS and Google Maps and satellite phones and VoIP before. I mean, they ran I think probably 24-hour center, ops center in a different country, they were talking to the guys as they went from room to room and said, no, shoot him, damn it, just shoot him. Stop looking at the rugs and set the place on fire. They had a little bug in their ear telling them where to go, telling them what the TV was showing about the law enforcement response to their attacks. That is a remarkable step forward in capability for the terrorists, and we can't go around taking away technological tools from law enforcement for reasons that are fundamentally Luddite. Where we say, well, it's creepy. We don't want them to have it. That's not policy making. That's what I would have said in the speech is it's a moral panic. It's something that 10, 15 years from now, you'll say, why did I care about that? Meanwhile, the law that was passed will continue to screw up operations for law enforcement intelligence for a generation.
So you can all listen very carefully to that last comment that Stewart doesn't think we're going to be worried about this 10 or 15 years from now. It reminds me of a mentor of mine who told me almost 20 years ago that this privacy thing wasn't going to work out for me as a career and that I should really diversify my legal portfolio. So I'm going to put that advice right up there with the other person's, that great things that don't actually come true. But you call this bunch a bunch of Luddites. So come on, guys, what do you got to say? There's got to be some questions in the audience. And I'm sorry, I'm holding the microphone, so I can hold it over to you, or I can repeat your question, whichever you prefer. Mike Godman. Bring it.
Great. When you said the FBI agent was criticized for his investigation, when you said that the FBI agent was criticized and effectively drummed out of the FBI, I think that's what you said. Is this John O'Neill? This is somebody else. Okay, the reason I ask that is that we know, like many of us, and maybe not as much as you, but certainly as much as I do, I'm obsessed about September 11th and what roles privacy policy might have played in that. And what I see is what I've been able to see through the sources I've read is that there are so many points of failure that trying to understand it in terms of FISA court overreach seems just as simplistic as any other simplistic theory. Some of it seems to be sometimes with personalities, with people who were perceiving a threat but weren't taken appropriately seriously. Sometimes it does certainly have to do with turf battles between agencies. But what I don't see emerging in all the different data that we now have 13 years later is a common emergent theme that this one thing, the Chinese wall between law enforcement and national security intelligence gathering was the problem. So I just want you to maybe elaborate a little bit on why you think that is the theory.
So I talked about this in my book, Skating on Stilts, which no one in this, I downloaded Glenn Greenwald's book on tour for obvious reasons, and I'm sure nobody here wants to give me any royalties, so you'll be pleased to know that it's Creative Commons licensed and available for free download if you go to skatingonstilts.com. But if you look at that book, the chapter lays out with footnotes the whole story, and you can certainly find other failures, but this is the failure 2 weeks before. This is a failure with a record in which somebody says, we can find him, why are you stopping us? And they are told to stand down, and the only reason they're told to stand down is because the FISA court, in pursuit of civil liberties, made up a bunch of law that was not law, that was later overturned by the Court of Appeals as soon as was appealed. It's hard to find a more proximate cause. Sure, you can find other causes, but this one feels very, very close. And no one wants to say it because, quite frankly, saying privacy contributed to this is not politically correct. But screw it, it's too late in my career to be politically correct.
According to the joint ID report, before I say this, I don't know how many of you guys know this, but the NSA was not, their Inspector General did not investigate any failures on the NSA's part to find the Tsarnaev brothers. 4 other agencies had to look into what they had. The NSA did not, their IG did not personally get involved. Now the NSA, what we do know is that the NSA had information on the Tsarnaev brothers before the attack. We also know, for anybody who follows counterterrorism, is that either Tsarnaev brother alone are about the only Muslim kids who downloaded Inspire in the country who didn't get stuck in an FBI sting. So we have a massive failure on the part of the NSA. They admit they had information on Tsarnaev, on a guy that we had a warning from Russia. So where is the accountability on the Marathon attack? Because the NSA had the hay and couldn't find the haystack even for a guy that the FBI had already investigated.
Let's see if that's going to work, actually. See if yours works.
Oh.
And then stop.
Is this working now?
No.
No.
All right. Mine seems to work.
I'm not sure what, let me stop and question the context of that. We're talking about what went wrong with 9/11 and some very serious and obvious problems that I attribute directly to civil liberties concerns that cost lives. And the response, if it's meant to be responsive, is to say, well, but you know, this is an incompetent agency. They missed another attack. So I'll answer the question, but I don't know that it really tells us anything about 9/11 or the civil liberties issue.
I think it tells us about having too much hay in the haystack.
Oh, okay, the hay in the haystack problem. Yeah, it is certainly a trope of civil liberties and privacy campaigners that you've got too much stuff. Well, let us do you a favor and take away some of your stuff, and then you'll be much more efficient. The problem is you never know which is the right hay to take away, or whether you're taking the needle away along with the hay. And I'm pretty skeptical of the idea that the solution to too much hay is just less hay. I think it's better tools for going through the hay. So the question then is, what was the reason for what you say is the failure? I don't know anything about the details of that.
So why do you not know the details that are now public about the NSA's failures to find the Tsarnaev brothers, but you're happy to talk about 9/11 when we have the most proximate failure on the part of the National Security Community is the Boston Marathon attack?
Well, as I said, I'm not blaming the privacy community for the Tsarnaev attacks. Though let me think some more about that. Maybe I can come up with something. But I studied the 9/11 story, and I looked at the wall, and I knew a lot about the wall before it was part of common discourse. So that's what I know about. I'm not really spending all my time focusing on intelligence failures. But all that said, I just don't see how the NSA not identifying the Tsarnaev brothers is necessarily, I'm not even sure it's their job to say what Americans are going to this site. They almost certainly would have, it's not unreasonable to say, maybe they should have told the FBI about all the IP addresses of all the people who went to Inspire, although that's awfully broad, and I wouldn't be surprised if under the president's current directive, that's a question of whether you're picking on people because of their exercise of their First Amendment rights. So there might have been, even today, some political correctness issues with just scarfing up everybody who ever went to that website, which would include probably you. There we go. And so they might have said, you know, that's too big a sweep, and you know, Marcy wouldn't like it if we swept up that much hay.
There's no feedback on
This
No.
whole setup seems like sort of like needlessly confrontational. Like I'm like rummaging up here, like all mad.
Now you guys can keep the mic.
Okay, great. Yeah, the Boston Marathon bombing is definitely the most obvious, most immediate proximal failure of this whole system for like any number of reasons, but not the least of which is the fact that you know what actually merited like the Department of Homeland Security getting looked at was Marty Walsh. He was an active Occupy Boston organizer, and that is so sketchy that he eventually became the mayor of Boston. Like, this is what they're spending all their time on. He was complaining about surveillance like 3 years ago. And, so that's what they would rather be spending their time on than stuff like this. It's being used across the board to suppress political speech, to suppress free speech, to marginalize communities that are already doing very poorly, like people of color, street workers, sex workers, people that are very, very poor. Like, this is not, I don't think that this is like a problem that we can fix just by saying, we need less stuff, or we need this, or we need that. We need a broad overhaul of the entire system.
So
I want to just point out,
you for a second there?
Would actually just like to point out also is that the haystack argument makes a fair bit of sense. Whenever someone goes and does a search warrant on someone's house, it's not like, okay, let's pack up everything in this house. Let's look for what might actually be relevant to a specific case. Broad spectrum surveillance is useless as far as I can tell.
So my sense on that is that the cops often gather everything because they've sort of learned from experience that if you don't gather it, it may turn out, maybe only one case in 10, that there's something important that you left behind. So and that's why they do take everything. This is in law enforcement. It's not my particular bailiwick, but that there is rationality to that decision. But I guess I was trying to get the connection. Let's say there was a failure. There's clearly was a failure to follow up on the Tsarnaev brothers. It was dumb, and I've said the same thing. I cannot understand why the guy wasn't stopped. Well, now I understand, but it's still an appalling failure that the guy was not stopped when he came back from Russia, and it was because they spelled his damn name wrong. Now, I'm not sure that argues for less hay on the haystack. It argues for better spell check on the haystack.
But that's not what the IG report shows. The IG report also shows that the NSA had identified the Tsarnaev brothers before the attack and not done it. They did not access that information until after the attack. That is what the IG report shows.
So they had. What does it mean to identify them but not access the information?
It means it's sitting in their haystack untouched.
Oh, because they went to Inspire.
It's not. We don't know because the NSA wasn't part of the actual part of the IG report, which is also inexcusable.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time with the intelligence community. I helped put together the explanation of how we screwed up the intelligence in Iraq, and screw-ups happen all the time, for sure. And I guess it doesn't say to me, oh, well, we need more privacy and less intelligence because our intelligence agencies are screwing up. It may argue for better intelligence rather than less.
Over time, we have 3 really
Okay.
quick speakers.
Okay, actually, I'm going to take this out because, first off, thank you so much for coming here and being in an open forum and taking questions off the cuff. I think that's really admirable. I just wanted to invite you to the Hackers on Planet Earth conference next month in New York City. Here's a flyer. And our keynote speaker is your really good friend, Daniel Ellsberg.
Oh, yeah.
So put in the mic back here for a second. I just had a quick question that I pulled off the internet. Do you think it is acceptable for other countries to perform dragnet surveillance on American citizens?
I'm against it. And I think we should do what we can to stop it. Protest it, protect Americans to the extent that we can. The fact is that dragnet surveillance, or at least bulk collection of data on Americans, is going to happen because it's getting easier and easier. But that doesn't mean that we have to like it. I'd rather spend time fighting over that than fighting over whether NSA could do it, because I think NSA is more trustworthy, at least as Americans go, than French intelligence or Chinese intelligence.
Speaking of the French,
Maybe.
thank you for coming, Stewart.
I'm always glad to come.
I really appreciated the piece you wrote for the Post, speculating that, so Vodafone released this new transparency report. In it, they indicated, the first telco to actually directly do so, that some countries have direct hookups into their systems so that without having to, like, say, hand a target identifier to the provider, the country can just unilaterally pick and choose its targets. The company doesn't know exactly what's going on. You speculate that France and Belgium are two of these countries. I guess my question is, first, do you think that is acceptable in a democracy? And if it is not, how do you distinguish between what you believe the French and the Belgians are doing, and the upstream collection that's being done under 702 by the National Security Agency, which, as far as we understand it, is authorized under an annual order by the FISA court, but whereby the government isn't saying, hey, telco, give us data on these people. They're plugged directly in to the feed and sucking up what they are choosing to get. So
As an American, I don't like French style of government. I think it is the ruling class, the ruling elite, the people who went to Sciences Po are too much of an institutional elite, and it's not the kind of democracy I want to live in. It is the one that the French want to live in, you could certainly have acceptable controls on an intelligence service that has that direct connection. Do I think the French have acceptable controls on their intelligence service? No.
And the Belgians?
The Belgians, you probably don't go wrong. This is maybe a little unfair, but their government institutions tend to be francophone and a sort of little brother to France. They're very influenced by French styles of governance, and I suspect French styles of intelligence gathering. So that's why I wouldn't be surprised if they had picked up the same approach that the French had.
But so direct connection to the telecom infrastructure is acceptable if it's American democratic culture, but not if it is Francophone.
I didn't say that. But our system is full of checks on the activities of the intelligence agencies. One of the problems in this area is it's always easy to say, oh, well, not enough oversight. But the fact is you need to come up with a practical oversight. And I'm not sure that anybody can plausibly make the case that just disclosing intelligence programs is good oversight. If you believe in intelligence, and we live in a dangerous world, I believe in it and most people believe in it, then the next question is, how do you get good intelligence and not have democratic failures, have abuses? And that requires a very skeptical, cynical even, assessment of what will scare the bureaucrats whose abuses you're worried about, and what will keep them under control in the long run, not just the bureaucrats, the politicians. I think we have come up with a system that is as likely to work in a context where you nonetheless keep the information confidential as you must to have any intelligence at all, as we're likely to find. Happy to tinker with it, but we have courts, we have multiple separate bureaucracies with their own separate interest. I used to say when I was at NSA, there were at least 5 people whose careers would be made if they could catch NSA violating the law. And then you've got oversight by quite carefully designated majority and minority party representatives, so that the temptation to misuse this capability for partisan advantage is dramatically reduced. Maybe there's another institutional way to approach this, but just taking these guys out who are doing their job and following the law and saying, well, let's just give them a beating for the hell of it, means you're going to get a whole lot less intelligence and no more effective civil liberties.
I'm not quite sure how responsive that was to the question, but thank you nonetheless. Great, thank you.
Last question, we're way over time.
So every year in America, we see 10 9/11s and car deaths. And we accept this because we want to be able to drive. We want freedom of movement. We want all of those things that gives us. Do you think that the American people, do you think it would be reasonable or acceptable for the American people to simply say, well, you know, we would rather not have intelligence, or we would rather have very limited intelligence only dealing with, you know, nation state threats that were a, not terrorist threat, but a like credible threat of invasion, for instance, that might, you know, completely erase American sovereignty, and simply say, you know what, there's going to be bombings, that's fine, we accept this risk. And if that opinion was expressed, do you think that, assuming that the intelligence community didn't share that opinion, as that seems to be the case, do you think that the American population could actually impose their will on an unwilling intelligence community and get them to stop doing that surveillance at the direct and acknowledged cost of 30,000 terrorist deaths a year?
So let me just start by calling bullshit on the idea that the intelligence services have their own ideology separate from the American people. They have an institutional interest, which is they believe that they will be blamed if there's another attack. And that no one will remember all this civil liberties stuff. They'll just say, why didn't you get your job done? So they push back on this because they think they have a responsibility that everybody will hold them to, even after having reduced their ability to carry out. But, you know, the idea that we would just say, well, 30,000 deaths from car accidents, 30,000 deaths from terrorist attack, you know, mach's nix. You know, there's that saying that even a dog knows the difference between somebody tripping over him and somebody kicking him. That is fundamental to human nature. When somebody deliberately attacks you and breaks all of your rules for social interchange, it is a bigger threat to your society, and it's a bigger threat individually, psychologically, than hearing that somebody has died in an accident. So I think there is a significant difference. I don't buy the equivalence. But yes, part of what I'm saying is to people, you want to listen to this stuff that I find complete crap about more privacy? That's fine. You're making the choice for more deaths. You remember that next time. Because I don't think you really want more deaths. You think you want more privacy if it's free, and it ain't free.
I'm sorry, guys. We're already 12 minutes over, and out of respect to our next speaker, I'm going to thank you so much again, Stewart, for joining us. And I know Stewart's going to be around for a little while, so if there are a few more questions, maybe he'll do them. He's going to stay for dinner so we can have our further conversation then. And thank you all for joining us. Thank you. Thank you.